I'd like to introduce you to Mark Remy, who is the director of creation.
I'm a creative development specialist here at the museum, and my responsibility is the overarching experience that a visitor has when they go through the exhibition.
And I think that experience is the most important thing, really, because then it draws people back and they also talk about what they've seen.
Well, I definitely appreciate you saying that. Yes, I mean, I don't want to elevate my role, but I think that, you know, in thinking of an exhibition, there are multiple elements that include the content, the experience, the design. So I'm just one of many people that was part of putting this together and adapting it for a Canadian audience.
Yes, because it came from Chicago, I believe.
That's right. So the exhibition was developed by the Field Museum in Chicago, but it was a remarkable partnership, a collaboration with 26 institutions from 11 countries in southeastern Europe. So what we see in here is not just the product of our work, the field's work, but really a testament to the work of all these institutions working together towards this common goal.
That's wonderful. It speaks well for art and history and education.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
Right, so let's go in and have a look. So we start right at the beginning, I believe.
That's right. So before I speak to this crown, the idea of the exhibition is, the way I like to frame it is, imagine you go to a movie on European royalty today, or the contemporary period. This is not that. This is the origin story of where that came from. And it speaks to questions of power, inequality, wealth, and so forth. So the way the exhibition is structured is with a crown from the relatively contemporary period of Queen Mary of Romania. The crown itself is a replica, but we use it as a bookend. So we begin with a contemporary crown to say this is where we are, and now we're going to go back in time and tell you how we got here.
Right, so let's move over to, I believe this is the beginning.
Yeah, so this speaks to the collaboration that I was mentioning earlier of the 26 institutions from across 11 countries in southeastern Europe. So what we're walking into here is the introduction of the exhibition. The intention is to present this story as a story, as like an epic tale, so to speak. So we try to bring this to life in a series of chapters. This is the introduction. As we move through the exhibition, though, we're going to go into chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. The intention of the introduction is, like any story, is to set the context, and that's what we're doing here, providing the time period of the exhibition, which spans the Neolithic, so about 8,000 years ago, to the Iron Age, so say about 2,000 years ago. So in total, we're going across 6,500 years of history in the region of what is today, present-day, southeastern Europe.
There are wonderful graphs and information for people to associate themselves with this before we go into the other chapters.
That's exactly it. So the intention is to set the audience up for success by giving them the tools they might need to get a better sense of what we're speaking about, where we are in the world, what time period we're speaking about. And to assist with that, there's also a video playing here, which tells the overarching narrative of the exhibition from beginning to end. It's about 2.5 minutes long, so if you have time, you can sit down, enjoy it, and then you'll have a sort of clear understanding of the story we tell as we move through the galleries.
A land before royals.
Right, so we are now transitioning out of the introduction that I just spoke to, and now we're moving into chapter 1 of the exhibition. So you might have noticed in the previous zone when I was talking about the time period, we had these hexagonal motifs, and they represent a material, a mineral, stone, copper, bronze, and iron. And the intention of this is to cue the visitor as we move through the galleries that you are moving through different ages. Chapter 1 is about the Stone Age, the Neolithic. Chapter 2, the Copper, Chapter 3, the Bronze Age, and then finally Chapter 4, the Iron Age. So this is the intention here. And as we move into the zone, you might overhear the sound of nature. This is to give this sort of a sense that we are in an agrarian community. This is a period marked by, relatively speaking, egalitarian farming societies. It's not to say that there weren't people without sort of distinguished themselves within those communities, but we're in a period that we don't really have the royals as we speak to later on in the exhibition.
But we still need the base for what comes.
Exactly, because it helps sort of paint a picture, so to speak, of transition. So as we move through the story, we see those things that transition us from a period of, again, relatively speaking, egalitarian farming societies to a period where we have much more marked hierarchies.
So you have some wonderful artifacts here. You have this set up like a village and a town.
That's right. So in this gallery, we have a variety of objects from the Neolithic period that help to communicate the message that I was just speaking to. So I'm not the curator, I'm not the content specialist, but what I can say is that we have figurines such as these. These small figurines likely represent women, and they also might represent a distinction within a community or possibly deities. Some are seated, some aren't, and I believe there are some interpretations to suggest that this is representing social distinctions of some kind or another.
So a lot of these things, as you mentioned before, were given by other museums and institutions.
Yes, the exhibition comprises about 700 objects that come from the 26 institutions in southeastern Europe. There are a handful of items that are from the Canadian Museum of History, but these are somewhat limited. Here in this case, we have a pig skull, wheat and barley, which again speaks to the agrarian communities that form much of southeastern Europe in the Neolithic.
We noticed that there's a lot of people coming through already, which must make you happy.
Yeah, it's actually very exciting. So we're seeing a lot of people coming through. It creates a nice buzz, and we're also seeing a diversity of people coming through, families with young children, members,
School children.
school groups, all types. So my hope is that it's an exhibition that will appeal widely to a variety of different people.
Right, let's go to the next chapter.
Sure. So as we move to the next chapter, we're going to move through a transitional zone. In this space, we have an audio-visual projection that depicts people smelting copper. And this is a visual cue to the visitor that as they move through it, we're moving into another period of time. And so again, here we encounter the hexagon that I mentioned, this time representing copper. And this zone is important because it's where we start introducing a bit more the idea of social distinctions. So with the emergence of copper in the Copper Age, people are able to distinguish themselves a little bit more for what they can do. So again, I'm not a content expert, but my understanding is that if you were to go back in time and imagine yourself as someone that had never seen the extraction of metal before, and you witness someone extracting metal from stone, it would appear sort of marvelous, perhaps even magical. And so we start to see these sort of the potential for greater social distinction here, and this is kind of what we're communicating through the object. So here, for example, we have a case that displays on the right-hand side darker axe heads. These are original axe heads from the period, and next to them are reproductions of what they would have looked like, similar to when they were created. And you'll notice that when they would have been new, they almost looked like gold. They're quite marvelous looking. And this is important because copper is in fact quite a soft metal. It's not great, certainly for
tools,
warfare,
yes.
Right? But what it does do is, again, it's attractive. There is probably a symbolic element to this, that, again, marks people of distinction who either control the production of copper or who have it in mass. In this zone, you also see a variety of gold-based objects that are also being used to demarcate status.
I guess jewelry began then.
In fact, actually, it began even earlier because in the Neolithic, which we just walked through, we do actually have examples of spondylus shell bracelets, headdresses, and necklaces. Spondylus is a type of shell, and it was being used in the Neolithic for those ends. So we actually see ornamentation occurring even earlier in the exhibition.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the next chapter.
That's right. So as we move through the zone, you'll see that there are interactive elements in this zone, including a digital interactive to my right, and to my left, a programming space where people can actually have an interaction with a program interpreter here at the museum and have a fun sort of trivia game where you learn a little bit more about metallurgy itself.
And it's showing some of the jewelry here.
Yes, that's right. So we have a variety of objects here that include gold and ceramics that represent perhaps a village or ceramic model houses.
I think the screens are very effective as well.
Yeah, so I'm glad you point that out. So as I mentioned, every zone is broken up by transitions that cue the visitor to the content and the messaging of the next zone. This is the case here. So as we move from the Copper Age, we're moving into the Bronze Age, and during this transition, this is also a period when we start to see the introduction of horses into this region. And to the narrative of the exhibition, we're seeing the emergence in the Bronze Age of a warrior elite because of the fact that this new technology of bronze is a harder metal that has more applications in terms of, from my understanding, of warfare. So a good example of that is over here in this case, where we have a selection of armor and weapons made of bronze, again communicating the fact that this technology is also allowing for the emergence of a warrior elite. So again, just backtracking here, is communicating this idea that over time we're seeing layers of social stratification that are happening over a period, in part as a consequence of the emergence of the new materials.
Yes, so again, I think we see beaten gold here.
Yeah, so actually this is very interesting. The piece in the middle is a greave. So if you don't know what a greave is, it's a piece of armor that would have been placed on the shin of your leg. It is made of gold. And again, gold is a very soft metal. It doesn't actually necessarily have the same sort of practicality as bronze might on the battlefield. So what's interesting about this is it seems sort of ornamental, or at a minimum representing status. So if you could imagine you were someone in southeastern Europe and you saw a horse riding warrior with golden greaves, it would be quite striking, and again marking this distinction between people.
It wouldn't protect in any way.
It would be, from my understanding, it'd be fairly limited value in that respect,
yes.
But certainly the symbolic value of wearing it wouldn't go unnoticed, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, in this zone, we're starting to see an increasing diversity in both the type of objects that we're presenting in the exhibition, as well as the materials that they're created. So here we have bronze swords, the armor I spoke of, we had gold to represent ornamentation. We also have some interactive elements in the exhibition, like this replica sword that visitors can touch. And as we eventually move into the Iron Age, you also see that we have objects made of precious stone, which I can show you later on.
There's a great array of tools and weapons here.
Yes, that's right. So this is a series of axe heads as well as a sword. And something that always strikes me, purely on a visual level, is actually looking at the detailing on the sword of the patterning that's on there. It's really quite beautiful. So I would recommend, if someone comes, to take all this in. There are a lot of objects to take in. But if you do a second pass, maybe take a little closer look and look at the detail that you see on the objects, because it's easy to miss on that first pass. On the second pass is where it really starts to pop and you start to notice it.
And you can actually touch a replica of the sword with the engraving.
Yeah, that's right. And you also see that our designer, our wonderful designer, Carrie McMaster, also borrowed from some of the patterning that you see in the objects.
Yeah.
In some of the graphics that were later developed by an illustrator for us.
They really were artisans.
Yeah, it's really quite incredible, purely from a visual level. Again, looking at the detail on some of these objects, and actually I can show you a piece that I find quite striking. Is this bronze wagon, which I just find completely unique. So it's made of bronze. It represents a wagon, but if you look closely at it, you'll notice that there's sort of a duck motif, or a water bird motif at least, with the heads on the top, they look like bills, and you see again the representation of them on the wheels. So again, I'm not a content specialist, but my understanding is that water birds had a spiritual connotation for the people of southeastern Europe, and so this sort of suggests some sort of spiritual connection.
I wonder what they'd put inside, because there's a lid on top.
So do I. In the back there's a little bronze lamp that looks like a duck. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was used as a lamp, and inside that one I believe they used fat for burning and to create light.
Yes. So our Inuit people did something similar in their igloos, having little oil lamps.
So here we have in the exhibition, in every zone of the exhibition, with the exception of the introduction, we have a burial zone where we focus on an individual's burial. In this case, the person was cremated, so to speak. There was a funeral pyre, and so we've communicated that with the audiovisual that's behind you. And I don't know if you've also noticed, but in the exhibition we have different illustrations on the walls. With every burial, we have an illustration of what the person may have looked like when alive, or someone that was there at the burial. The reason we portray them alive is, again, to really remind people that these people weren't just objects, they were living, breathing human beings worthy of the dignity and respect that they're owed. So this was an important element to us in considering this.
Yes, and they've replicated the water,
so this is the idea that this was buried in the ground. So the intention here is to sort of suggest the process of burial. It's not, this is more evocative than it is didactic. But again, it's to sort of give a visual sense. So while there are burial sections in each zone of the exhibition, there are no human remains themselves. So what we've tried to achieve is to represent a character illustration of what a person might have looked like in life, to represent the dignity and respect that they deserved, as a reminder to individuals that these were real, living, breathing people. In terms of the other character illustrations, you may have noticed the warrior on the wall.
Yes.
Again, the character illustrations that we have on the walls, aside from the ones associated with the burial zones, are really being used to cue the visitor to the messages of the space. So if we were to work backwards, you would have seen in the Neolithic period a female farmer. In the Copper Age zone, a craftsperson pouring metal. Here we have a warrior, and then when we move into the next zone, you'll see a representation of a king. To communicate again that social stratification.
So let's move into royalty.
Great. So as we move through, you'll see our third and final transition, which is of an army at the gates. And again, this is cueing visitors to the fact that in this period, we had seen the warrior lead in the Bronze Age, but as we enter into the Iron Age, we're seeing not just a warrior elite, but the actual creation of armies. And so we have, at the behest of, say, the most powerful. The first case that you see here is of an iron sword. You'll see time has taken its toll. This is because iron degrades very, very quickly relative to other metals. So for this reason, we don't have a lot of examples of iron objects, but we do have a few, including this sword, and I believe another sword and a dagger closer to the end of the exhibition.
So this is supposed to be a replica of that, or it's just
This one, I believe, is just to give a sense of what an iron sword may have looked like, and for visitors to sort of feel it and touch it.
Right.
As we move into this zone, something to note is you hear sort of singing voices. This is because we're moving sort of increasingly indoors as the exhibition progresses. Again, if we went back in time about 10 minutes ago when I walked you through the Neolithic, it was very airy outdoor sound. As we move into the Iron Age, we're progressing more and more to this idea of structure. And this is why we have the representation of audio, from an audio standpoint as well as a visual standpoint, the trusses on the ceiling of being indoors. This is also the zone with the most amount of objects. Many of the objects are really quite exquisite and ornamental, again, evocative of the people that we're speaking of, sort of the higher ups. One example is a small earring over here, a gold earring, to my knowledge represented the goddess Nike. And if you take the time to really look at it, you can see it's just exquisite detail. And to imagine that this has survived about 2,000 years is really quite remarkable. If you
It's magnificent.
It is, and if you look closely, you can actually still see her finger pointing on the chariot.
It's just beautiful. It's exquisite.
It really is.
And it's from Bulgaria.
That is my understanding, yes. And this, if you're looking for a clear image, there is a photograph where you can see it in close up.
I guess the gods and religion started to really play a part as we go through the ages.
Well, this is something, again, like as not the content specialist, I can't really speak to, but it is interesting to consider that. I spoke earlier to the
Amber.
Ornamentation and precious materials, stones. This is amber. And again, it's one of those objects that on first pass, I mean, it's stunning on its own, but when you look at some of the stone, you can actually see detailing and patterning on them, which is quite remarkable.
It is remarkable.
I'll move us through here. Again, as far as messaging goes, I spoke earlier about the character illustrations. In this case, this is the king that I mentioned. We have, again, in this Iron Age zone of the exhibition, a remarkable sort of diversity of both the type of object and the material that it was made from.
Protective wear.
That's right.
For war.
That's right. Other iron objects that I mentioned earlier are located over here, which includes an iron sword, as well as, I believe, the tip of an iron spear. And as we move through the exhibition, we gradually reach the culmination, so to speak, of the exhibition and the end. So if you recall, when we entered the exhibition, the first object that we saw was a crown, a contemporary replica of Queen Mary of Romania's crown. And here we end on another crown, or a wreath in this case, from the Iron Age, as well as a variety of other objects that again are just quite spectacular. Over here we have silver, I believe, I hope I get the pronunciation correct, rhytons, which were drinking vessels. And if I'm not mistaken, what's interesting about them is that, you know, they're functional in the sense of something to drink out of, but they would have been quite dysfunctional in terms of trying to set them down. So the belief is that the royalty of this period enjoyed their wine and enjoyed the acts of feasting.
Very ornamental, just beautifully created.
Really gorgeous. Here we have a helmet. This one's interesting for different reasons. My understanding is it includes patterning and detail that evoke different connections with different regions. So that's an important part of this story too here, especially in the Iron Age, where we see growing connections with other regions like with the Greeks. But also, I believe in this helmet, there's evidence of connections with the Persians based on the imagery on it itself. Again, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe if you look closely, above the open space where you would imagine someone's eyes are, there are also detailed eyes above, which I believe were to ward off.
Evil spirits?
Yes, evil. That's right.
The evil eye.
That's right. And then finally, as I mentioned, the wreath, which obviously has great symbolic value. It's gold. In the middle of it, you can see it actually in the light being projected above. There is another depiction, and again, it's believed to be the Greek goddess Nike. So here again, we see it. And again, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the Greek goddess Nike represented victory, which makes sense on a wreath.
To be adorned on the wreath.
That's right. And then a collar, and finally a small signet ring, which has a depiction of someone handing a crown to an individual on horseback. So again, the sort of storytelling that these objects communicate, their representation, but also just the sheer beauty of them is quite remarkable.
It certainly is. When you think back at what they created and the tools that they could use, the metals that they had.
Absolutely.
But it's a wonderful tour through the history of arriving to this.
That's right, and I hope you enjoyed it. This was the intention, was again to do that kind of storytelling, initially with the context to set the visitor up for success, and then to be moved through the periods, the Neolithic, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, where we tell the story of sort of growing inequalities and the emergence of the first royals of Europe.
It's really educational, wonderful, and I'd like to thank you very much, Mark.
Well, thank you, Barb, for the interest. Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.